Welcome, friends. You are live on the Rebound Live webcast. Today's topic is politics and the truth. Let me introduce my special guest, Diana Florence. Diana is the former prosecutor for the Manhattan DA's office in New York City, ran for the DA position in 2021. More importantly, she has 2 degrees from the fine University of North Carolina. She has spent more than 25 years in criminal law, standing up for those who abuse power to hurt those who live, visit, and work in Manhattan. Diana has won landmark conviction after landmark conviction. Diana, welcome to the Rebound Live webcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited for the conversation this morning.
Yes, and it's so timely to have you with all that's going on, obviously, in New York City with our former president. But we really are here for you and to understand your story of rebounding from being a candidate for the DA's office in New York to losing that race, and then how do you recover from that? I want to start out is, how did you decide to become a district attorney or a prosecutor?
Well, as a kid, unfortunately, I have a brother that's severely autistic, and my parents, when I was very little, used to leave a lot to try to figure out. This is in the early 70s. They didn't really know what autism was, and so I was left with babysitters a lot and in front of the television. And so I used to watch Sesame Street and then Electric Company and then the Watergate hearings. They were all just one show to me. And when I would, my parents would come home, I would sort of talk about what had happened in the hearings, alongside what happened with Grover and Ernie and Bert. And so my parents at that point, thought perhaps I would be a lawyer. But originally I used to love to sing, and I ended up going to UNC on a music scholarship, which lasted one semester when I realized I didn't really quite have the talent other than to get into UNC with music. I was not going to be the next Madonna. So I ended up going to law school at UNC. And what honed me in on becoming a prosecutor was my 3rd year. I worked in the criminal law clinic, which was run by, some excellent people, Michelle Robertson, who I'm still in touch with, who's wonderful. And because I studied abroad my junior year in Seville, Spain, I was fluent in Spanish. And at that time in the mid 90s, they didn't provide interpreters for low-level criminal cases, misdemeanors. So I was the de facto lawyer for all those misdemeanors. And as their defense lawyer, on drunk driving or low-level shoplifting, I saw case after case being sort of processed. And no matter how, sort of vigorous my argument or how much the law was on my side, at the end of the day, it really came down to who was on the other side, who was that prosecutor, and whether or not they would, show mercy and be able to see, the nuances of the case. And so I realized that a really fulfilling way to use my law degree would be to actually be a prosecutor and not be sort of the, jailing machine, but to actually look at each case individually, with humanity, not to throw away the key, but also not to say, dismiss everything. And so that's what ultimately motivated me. And because I'm originally from New York, I wanted to come back to New York. And of course, Robert M. Morgenthau, who's one of my mentors, he was the longtime district attorney, and I was fortunate enough to get the job right out of law school in 1995. And I was there through 2020. Wow.
You had a heck of a run. Tell us about the biggest landmark case, if you can, that you were involved in, and what were the challenges that went along with that?
Yeah, I'll just sort of briefly backtrack, say for 5 years, I worked in domestic violence cases, and that was incredibly fulfilling, but also incredibly hard. And, I've always been, I think because I had that sort of soul of an artist, I always looked at the law creatively. So even in doing domestic violence, I found a way to do cases without the victim's testimony. And that was sort of distinguished me in the office originally. Then I moved in 2000 over to the white collar division, and really my sort of star started to rise after, unfortunately, 9/11, when there were many, many fraud cases. first big press case I did involved a man who had 13 children, but not 14. And he made up a son and collected hundreds of thousands of dollars from the charities. So proving the non-existence of a person in the, in the aftermath of 9/11, and kind of working with survivors, who had been in the towers to prove this person didn't exist, that kind of put me on the map. And then I sort of was known for doing these kind of, complicated white collar cases. I always sort of looked at it like a puzzle. I'd say the case that really kind of put me on the trajectory to run for DA, though, was the Testwell case. And that was, interestingly, also related to 9/11 in that in the rebuilding of the World Trade Center, it was discovered somewhat accidentally that the concrete, which was spec'd out to be 12,000 PSI, which is incredibly strong concrete, was actually only 7,500 PSI. And it turned out that the company that was doing the testing, that was responsible for the integrity of the steel, the concrete, all the building materials, had been faking the tests. And that, in fact, if the World Trade Center had continued being built with that concrete, it would not have been a stable building. And it wasn't just the World Trade Center. When I got the case, it started with that. But, sort of knowing that human nature, if you cheat one place, you're not going to be honest in, 10 other places. You're probably going to institute one, sort of cheating mechanism. It ended up extending to Yankee Stadium, the new Second Avenue subway, and about 200 other, sort of places. The case was a landmark in that I brought together both the private and public sector, because to do a case like that, and it ended up being a racketeering case against the, the C-suite of that company. And it really revealed an underbelly of, the construction industry is obviously not known to be, pristine, but this was these were engineers and architects, and they're supposed to be a cut above. And yet they were perpetuating this massive fraud that we were able to reveal that was in this company, but also in the industry. And so I was really proud of that. But the last case I'll sort of mention, in my sort of as a highlight that I'm especially proud of, was one of the last cases that I did, which involved the death of a 22-year-old undocumented immigrant who was working in a trench in the meatpacking district. And despite warnings over 2 hours, this man named Carlos Moncaya was buried alive on the construction site because they refused to implement safety. Why it was landmark was that he didn't just hold accountable the supervisor, his direct supervisor, which is sort of the usual. You sort of everything goes low level, but I always prosecuted up, and it was that the people on the developer side were aware of the safety, situation and the cuts, and they were pushing forward for an unsafe condition. And so in convicting, the general contractor or the developer alongside the subcontractor, I uncovered that the law itself had some deficiencies, and that the maximum fine for the company was $10,000. So that's not even one day of construction. So because of that case, I worked tirelessly alongside unions and other, politicians, and Carlos's law, I'm so proud to say, was just signed into law this last December, which raises the fines for, unscrupulous companies that commit felonies to $500,000. So that's sort of the trajectory of the cases that I did. I sort of started as the artist, if you will, and then became a construction lady.
let me ask you this that comes to mind. And, I have a script and I shared that with you last night, but then things hit me. And first of all, for those of you that joined maybe after we started, this is the first time in the history of the Rebound Live webcast I brought a married couple together from Singapore and New York City. So welcome, Scott Peeler from Singapore. Yeah, there we go. How all this came about is I met Scott. We're both on the board of visitors, UNC Board of Visitors, and then his wife, Diana, who also is a Carolina graduate, double Tar Heel, art history, Spanish, and law, I think, if I have that right.
Yep.
And we got talking in New York, and I thought, she runs for this DA's position, loses, and now you've got to kind of rebuild. But before we get to that part, what hits me, and I've heard this about New York policemen, and we have several people on this webcast from New York or New Jersey. And if you're from New York City or Long Island or New Jersey, raise your hand just so we can see here, so this is really interesting stuff. The thing that I wonder, you're surrounded by a lot of bad people, and you're unearthing a lot of people with bad intent. How do you, Diana, transition to neutral, where you see somebody, you meet somebody, and you can drop a guard and not start to think suspiciously that this person's selling me something at this newsstand and they're trying to screw me? Like, how do you overcome that maybe tainted view of people, especially in New York City?
I watched a lot of Hallmark movies, actually.
to counterbalance
like Xanax for the eyes.
Yeah.
After very intensely fighting with sort of white shoe defense attorneys and judges and whatever, and dealing with construction, it was very much a way to sort of to unwind. But no, I mean, I think I've always had a good ability to sort of separate. I think it's important. You can't have a cynical view that everyone is guilty. I mean, you have to do the work, right? I mean,
Right.
For me, every case started with a shred of something, and then it needed to be proven. I can't certainly just assume somebody is bad just because I got an allegation. So that's something I've always been really prided myself on, that I didn't bring cases unless I was 100% sure.
So when Scott walks through the door after a late business dinner, he gets a fair trial?
He does.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. All right. When and why did you decide to run for New York City, Manhattan DA's position?
So, I've never been one of these people, never ran for, student council president. I wasn't necessarily someone that thought of myself as, on a trajectory to be in politics. I really loved being an ADA, and I loved the work that I was doing. After Carlos's case, it started in 2015, but it went through different iterations. There were 4 different trials. As that case got a lot of attention, I started to go out of my office. I started to go to consulates and worker centers and construction sites, wherever I could find people. I would go to, even, developer conventions to sort of spread the gospel of following the law and safety. And I found in meeting people that a lot of people said, this guy, Cy Vance, my former boss, was probably not going to run. Me Too had started, and, it was clear that he was probably not going to run, and it was going to be an open seat. And some of the unions who were very appreciative of the work that I'd been doing in the construction area sort of said, hey, if you think you're going to do it, we would support you. So, it sort of became something that at first sounded preposterous. And then suddenly I'm finding myself, filing a committee and throwing my hat in.
Here's this lovely lady from Dix Hills, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. UNC, you're running for a DA's position in New York freaking City. How, this is where the topic we talked about is politics and the truth. How does that collide? You're an attorney, supposed to be by title, all about integrity, and then you get into the political side of running for DA. How dirty did it get? What was the most egregious thing that was said about you that you felt wasn't true? You decide to defend or you don't defend? Tell us, walk us through that path. Sure.
So as I mentioned, the last 5 years or so, I was in the district attorney's office. My profile started to rise. And I was always a thorn in the side of, frankly, the white shoe defense bar, because I was always bringing these cases and frankly, I was winning. And I think that when I look back, I think I had a bit of a naivete. I was always like a fan as a kid of like Quantum Leap. And do you remember that show? I think it's on again now. And, one of the sort of taglines was, put right what once went wrong. And so I felt like as a lawyer that's what I was doing. I didn't have a time machine, but I was able to do the best that I could with the law. And, so I felt very comfortable that because I was doing the right thing, that at the end of the day, even if there was animus, it was going to be fine. But there was a lot of jealousy in the office. There were a lot of lawyers that, my old boss, Cy Vance, it was not what it was under Morgenthau. It was very political. People that had connections would go over your head to try to get better deals, and they often did. And I wasn't really having it. So, but I always sort of, as I said, naively thought, well, I'm protected because I'm doing the right thing and everything's fine. But what ended up happening is a mistake on one of my cases. There was a discovery in a trial, and I had directed everything to be turned over, but 2 of the 14 statements by one of the cooperators was not turned over. And this would be normally harmless, but it became something that was blown completely out of proportion in the press. It was suggested it was exculpatory, that I was hiding evidence. All of this wasn't true. And even the judge in the case making a very strange ruling to dismiss the case, which was unprecedented, said there was no intent and this was just a mistake. But that mistake, though, was ultimately, it was amplified, it was repeated. And even though I'd had 25 years of, incredible work, and I had, actually even had an open discovery policy before that was even, something that was, cool and trending. That was something that I had to continuously answer to. And it was hurtful to me because, I think of myself as someone who, I'm not perfect, but I never made mistakes on cases before. And part of the reason I didn't is because I always said, come in and see whatever you wanted. But I think what was really painful was realizing that the facts didn't really matter. It became about a narrative. And, luckily, it wasn't just that. I did have 23 unions, supporting me. So it wasn't as if my candidacy was dead on arrival, but that mistake, kept coming back to haunt me, and I constantly had to answer for it. And I think one of the most disillusioning things was that, sort of institutions that I formerly revered, like the New York Times and, big newspapers, they didn't even want to hear it. They had created a narrative about me that ignored who I was and just focused on a mistake.
Wow. That's where I wanted to go.
I figured I'd make it easy for you.
I wanted to drill down on that. Facts didn't matter. It was amplified and repeated. And then you have institutions like the New York Times that didn't really maybe want to hear the truth, or at least your side of the story. You would be protected because you were doing the right thing. Put right what once was wrong. Black and white. And unfortunately, the world's not black and white. I struggle with that because I'm black and white. It's like right or wrong. And you put it in a box, but there's nuance. And I think that's a tough thing for all of us to manage, is the nuance, the gray. The facts didn't matter. And you had to sit there and get hit with this repeated narrative. What did you, looking back, how should you have tried to defend yourself? Or do you go on the offensive and go after another candidate? And, that's the dirty side of politics, right? The politics and the truth. It wasn't true, at least to the extent where they embellished the mistake that you made. You were open. The judge, kind of dismissed it. But, once it's repeated over and over, that ball becomes bigger and bigger. It's going downhill. It's hard to stop. So looking back on that, what tactics should you have taken in that campaign?
I mean, I think that because I felt so badly that this had happened. I mean, I often would think to myself, again, maybe on my time machine narrative, that, if I had a time machine and I could fix one thing, would I go back and kill Hitler, or would I fix this mistake, right? And I mean, I should want to, Hitler's worse than this mistake, certainly. But I will say to you that I would go over and over. How did I miss it? How did I not catch that this happened? Why didn't I double check the paralegal? And see, the problem is I'm not a person, ultimately I was lead counsel. I'm not going to blame a 22-year-old paralegal for a mistake. But it also, I think there was an incredible amount of self-blame. And I'm still getting over it, to be honest, because it's still hard. I still can't believe that happened. But I think part of it too is that the response to it was so unprecedented. Mistakes happen all the time. Nobody does perfect litigation, but the constant articles and hammering. And the reality was, at least in the political aspects, I kept, again, perhaps naively thinking, well, I have this incredible body of work. I did the first domestic violence cases without victims. I prosecuted 9/11 fraudsters. I did all these big things. Won't matter. People will see it for what it is. But the reality was, facts also don't matter on the other side. The candidates who ran against me just embellished what they did. And I would call it out because I knew that they didn't know what they were talking about. But in the end, people didn't really, it's too much in the weeds,
much in the weeds.
Yeah, my campaign staff would say, nobody really cares that you did it, right?
Right.
All look like we're experienced lawyers.
Politics and the truth. And this is where we really connected. You listened to a podcast that I was on for UNC and talking about losing my job and the narrative that was painted for me and the damage it did to my career, and the truths that I couldn't really share or didn't want to share. And if I did, it would just make me look bad, even though it was the truth, right? So it's almost like if you start to defend it, it just makes it look worse. So you kind of have to take the hit, right. And then it ruins your career. It sets your career back, and people go on, and you see Alvin Bragg in the news now, obviously with the Donald Trump case, and you're left like collateral damage. I use this analogy a lot. The speedboat's going. There's a driver of the speedboat, and we're falling off, and we're drowning in the wake, and no one cares, right? So there's a lot of triggers. Like I can only imagine, like I have triggers like the NCAA tournament. Last night, UConn wins the national championship. FAU is in the freaking Final Four. I was the head coach at FAU. And so like I should be there. What are your triggers now, Diana? And how do you manage them? And they're all over. You can't hide. I can't hide from college basketball. You can't hide from the DA's office in Manhattan, especially since that's your home. How do you deal with the triggers?
It's not easy. I mean, the whole concept, and I didn't really talk about the task force that I created, the construction fraud task force, which came out of Test Well, which sort of brought together private and public partners to investigate fraud and safety abuses in the industry. And I created this model, and I was the first person to go after wage theft and make it, something that was not strictly civil. So, a few months ago, I think, the Manhattan DA's office announced this, task force that was going to focus on wage theft, and it was announced as if it was a new thing. And of course, I'm raging into my poor husband. That's why he's in Singapore, probably, because it's hard, because we're human, and I'd love to tell you I'm a selfless angel, but I want credit. It's hard to not want the credit. And then I take a step back and I say, but at the end of the day, I have to be happy that, frankly, people that don't normally feel comfortable going to a district attorney's office, now I've normalized it. So that's that's ultimately, I have to kind of take solace in that. And I think, like for you, for example, as much as it hurt, ultimately the 2005, championship for UNC were your players. And so
Right.
at the end of the day, and your circle knows, and you hope that, without getting religious, you hope that God or the higher power has some plan that, made it necessary for it to go this way. You hope so anyway.
No, I mean, and I do think that God, puts hardship in your way so you lean closer on him, and not on our understanding. And it's just, the trigger. I mean, Roy Williams climbing the ladder in 2005, cutting down the nets, and I'm in the green room down in Chelsea Pier, working for what is now CBS College Sports, and the producers like saying, "Hey, we got to go on set. Like, let's go." And I'm like, "I need a minute." And the phone rings, and Terry Holland, who just passed away a few months ago, called me and said, "You should be proud. That's your team." But it still hurts.
Yeah.
And the other thing is the reality that your Rolodex, nobody knows what a Rolodex is anymore, but your Rolodex gets reduced by at least 75%, right? I mean, people you work with that would call you that you thought were friends, all of a sudden don't call you anymore because you can't do anything for them. They love the position, not the person. And for anybody here, I know we got Evan Elberg, who's interviewing for head coaching positions, and other people. Dan Dolan's been very successful in business. It's like sometimes we need that reality check. Robert Wordan was a player in the NBA, NBA coach. A lot of people on this show have had high-level positions, and then don't be fooled. Like, a lot of people like you because your position, not necessarily who you are, and to keep that balance. Diana, I'm trying to do the right thing and be a good citizen and choose the right candidates in elections, whether it be presidential elections, local elections. I find it hard as heck to mine for the truth and get a real sense of who is who, what is what. What advice can you give us as the general public as we get prepared for elections in the future to really find out the truth about candidates?
Yeah, it's really tough, honestly. I think that, for example, my website was all my ideas. They were, from doing the work, right? It's not because I was this brilliant person. You learn enough doing work that you know what works and what doesn't. And so if a person were to look at my website, they would have seen real, action, not just, we should treat everybody better and we should throw people in jail, or, it was very nuanced. And I think doing your research, clicking on the websites is important. If you can get to a candidate forum, I think that's the best. I know for me, I mean, I raised the least amount there were 9 candidates in my race. I raised about $280,000, which, so talk about my Rolodex. I think there are a lot of people that have blocked me because
What was Scott doing? I mean, wasn't he your campaign manager? Geez, Scott.
He was
He's
not.
in Singapore.
But I mean, I was up against a billionaire who put $5 million of her own money. And then, of course, Alvin Bragg was very much the sort of institutional person. So, but one of the things I learned was, when I met people face to face at subway stops, or at things, it was still COVID, so it was tough, but I won people over because I knew what I was talking about. So I would just say, in elections, and I try to do this now, I really try to read people's websites. I try to learn. I mean, we have in New York, and I don't like what, it's not about Republican or Democrat, but I think most people can agree that George Santos is a clown, right? And, he's the candidate he won the congressional election in Nassau County. And I mean, the guy, nothing he said was true. And there was really, except for a small paper on the North Shore, everyone just accepted it and no one questioned it. And I think if people had just paid a little more attention to him, perhaps he wouldn't be, in Congress right now.
Wow. Wow, wow, wow. I've got Terry Lyons with a hand up. Nassau County, speaking of Nassau County, Holy Trinity High School. He left the greatest state in the world, turned his back on our state, and he lives in freaking Boston. I still have a hard time dealing with that. But before we get to you, there's a couple of comments that I think are pretty interesting in the chat. Brian Moran said, a lie will make it halfway around the world before a truth gets out of bed in the morning. And then David Force said, we wonder why people with true integrity are not attracted to the political arena. I agree with that wholeheartedly. Diana, if you had to do it again, would you run?
Yes, I would. Even knowing the results, I learned a lot about how things work. I mean, I'm not cynical now, but I think I'm more realistic. I think I truly believed I could win. And I still think perhaps if I had $1 million, I might have been able to run TV ads, and maybe I would have won. I don't know, maybe not. But I believe in the power of the law to make things better, and for the district attorney's office not to be a social work organization, but also not to be a jail factory. I miss that work every single day, because I know how much good it can be accomplished when it's wielded the right way. So yeah, I would do it.
I could feel it, and I could feel it when you and I and Scott met for coffee that morning in New York. Your passion, your love for what's right, and your love of people, it's really powerful. Let's go to the raised hands. All right, Terry, tell me something. You're not pulling for the Red Sox, are you? I mean, is that Fenway in the background?
Yeah, that's Fenway, man. When in Rome.
Jeez,
I still
what a sellout. Anyway, go ahead, Terry.
I still have a place in my heart for the New York Mets, of course.
Yeah,
it is fun. It is fun to watch the Boston Celtics play every night too, by the way.
Yeah. All right, go on. Get on with your question, Terry. You're on the clock.
Basketball. Yeah, the question is I come from a public relations and communications background. What did you do from that from that discipline to fight off some of the things that you experienced? Did you have your own firm? Did you go aggressively in the PR world? Did you spend a couple you said about your budget was a little short. What steps did you take? And then I do have a follow-up, Matt, if you don't mind.
No,
sure. Yeah. I wrote a lot of op-eds on topics that were important to me, and sort of showed my knowledge. I also, the thing that I said, but which unfortunately was drowned out, because again, unfortunately, there is once a narrative is set, it's very hard to overcome. But, in New York, the Judiciary Committee of the bar vets you, and some people are found to be, competent or approved or not approved. And so these are like the cream of the crop lawyers who vet you. And I was vetted and I was approved. Some of the, because I didn't, because there was no integrity issue, because this was a true mistake. But others in the crowded field were not approved. But unfortunately, I think it wasn't even the money, honestly, because I don't think at the end of the day, it's the reason I lost. I do think at the end of the day, the reason I lost is I didn't have the money. I didn't have millions of dollars. And when you go up against millions of dollars, you just can't. I mean, I converted tons of people at the farmers markets and the subways, but the reach is just not there. So that's, I think I did the best I could, but it was tough.
Follow up, Terry.
I guess it's a point in PR 101 type of thing. But Matt, you've gone completely opposite of that point, which is the point being that most people in a situation address it, preferably the next day that something happens. You what we call, you tell it yourself, you tell it all, and you move on, and you never really address it again. Now, Matt, you're really doing a great job with teaching what happens when you do have to rebound, and I applaud you for that. But the general feeling in the industry is you never look back. And there's a guy that used to be in office that has mastered that aspect of what, public relations. So I guess I would just look for your comments on that, both of you, really. And
I mean, I'll just say it was, I of course would try to address it, move on, but it constantly was brought up. So it was not something I could necessarily control. So I think, again, my, not so humbly, my extreme competence in the work that I did, ultimately, that's what would win people over or not. But at the end of the day, I think some of it, quite honestly, it's also forgiving yourself. As I said, I didn't do anything nefarious. I made a mistake. But again, I hold myself to such a high standard, and I feel so strongly, that, things need to go a certain way. And I think even as time has passed, I'm still healing from it a little bit, which sounds a little crazy, but I don't want it to, I don't want a mistake, or even, the fact that I'm no longer a prosecutor to sort of define me. I know I have a lot to give, and I'm doing that in other contexts, but it's still hard. And I still, I'm still getting over it. I'm sorry to say, I wish maybe I'm not perfect for Rebound. I'm like almost bound or something, but
I'm going to interrupt. And JD Walsh, thank you. JD may have gotten off, but he talked about, and this is where I really like to go with this show, even a deeper dive of your personal perseverance and techniques to move forward after this personal and professional challenge. Is there someone you talk to? Is there books you read? Is there, meditation? What have you done to help you persevere and rebound from this setback?
Yeah, no, of course, I've talked to my husband, to close friends, and to forgive myself, for making a mistake again, but also putting it in context, because again, I think as women, and perhaps just me, like I always sort of doubted for a long time. I remember in my 20s, I used to be like, oh, everyone's smarter than I am. And in my 30s, I was like, well, maybe I'm smarter than some people. And then as I got more confident, maybe I went the other way. I was like, wait, I'm smarter than most people. But I think that I've gotten to the point now, sadly, my 50s, where I'm confident in my abilities, and I know that the work that I did and the way I see the world, and the way I'm able to sort of, synthesize facts and kind of see it in the legal way, is different than the average lawyer and different than the average person. And I have a lot to give. And so I think distance is good. Talking to family is good. But ultimately, like I said, just coming to terms with the idea that, you're more than your worst day.
Wow, that was pretty good. Pretty good. The thing that hit me there, I wrote down confidence. When you're younger, you don't have as much confidence, but even, I know this shocks you. I'm 61. I mean, you guys are all like, wow, really? I mean, I think he's like 40. I know. We'll go into that in a future show. The self-talk, like there's so many people I deal with in the coaching world, the executive coaching world, that, call it imposter syndrome, the negative self-talk. You think the worst thing, you overthink things. We all need encouragers in our lives, people to call us, the Terry Hollands, and say, hey, you did a good job. That's your team. You should be proud. Who besides maybe Scott and a couple other people, any people that you recall that reached out to you? Because you remember who called you after a defeat, and you remember who didn't.
Yeah.
Like I remember who called me after I lost my job at North Carolina. And more importantly, I remember who didn't call me. And I'm still waiting for a phone call about 20 something years later.
Yeah, no, it's,
What surprise is there? Who called you? That was a surprise. You
yeah.
know, who are the encouragers in your life in that situation?
Yeah, so my core group, they call it like a kitchen cabinet of my campaign. You know, they've been steadfast. One of them was the former right hand to Robert Morgenthau, and so many of the people that were, and you know, in my corner were Morgenthau faithful, if you will. And you know, I have such, you know, he's not perfect. I mean, you know, I put Morgenthau in the same camp as a Dean Smith, you know, and so he's that kind of larger than life, you know, incredible character. And you know, I think you know, they were in my corner and continue to be. I find, you know, what's interesting. Yeah, there are people that disappointed me that, you know, still disappoint me a bit. But then every so often, I'm sure this happens to you, Matt, I get emails or random text messages from people who were just jerks to me, you know, or just totally abandoned me. And then they'll write like, oh, you know, I saw Carlos's law passed and good for you and hope you're well. And I just, you know, I get, you know, I just sort of ignore them because you know, Scott, who's much sweeter than I am, says, no, you should reach out. I'm like, no, I think I've gotten to the point in my life where I value people, you know, that have been true friends. I also play a lot of tennis. One of my tennis buddies is on here, and, you know, that has been therapy in its own way. I'm not the athlete that you are, Matt, but it's, you know, it's incredibly cathartic to hit a ball really hard.
Yeah. Yeah. You sound like a better athlete than me, because my athletic prowess now goes to hitting a golf ball and getting in a golf cart. Or with Danny Dolan, we walked the fairways of East Lake down in Atlanta, or pickleball, which is not as, you know, doesn't exert as much energy as tennis. You know, you just touched on something. One of my core values is positivity, respect, trust, commitment, positivity. And I've tried to reduce the energy suckers in my life. And one thing that I've tried to do, and I'm not good at, is learning to ignore. And I think that's one thing that you just touched on, that you learn to ignore and don't waste time. Because you know what? I'm listening to the book. I have a little over, if I live to 80, 81, I've got a little over 1,000 weeks left in my life. 1,040 to be exact. So we shouldn't be wasting it with energy suckers, right?
Yeah.
Steve Cost. Welcome.
Hey, Matt. Thank you.
Welcome.
Hi, Diana.
Hi.
So just Matt, just for you first, and then just have a quick question for Diana. So Matt, it's amazing. We come from a very, you know, same cloth, similar backgrounds, sports and you know, leadership and everything else. I can relate to you with your emotion about how things have played out in your life. And yes, you know what? I should have been there and I could have been there. And imagine if that happened that way. There's so many things that happen in my life that way too, especially in the corporate world, where I see people that weren't authentic, that played a certain game, that lied, that just weren't real. And they got to these places and I'm like, wow. And because of my authenticity, straight up realness, telling the truth, being courageous, going against the grain, challenging things, there were times in my career where that backfired. And it's so, you know, fortunately, because of my perseverance and competitive fire, you know, I've been able to get to where I am today still. But I just want to know I can relate to exactly where you're coming from an emotion point of view, because I could sit here right now and probably get into tears if I got into some of the stories. So this is just a great venue.
That's what this is all about, because I want to bring stories that are in the news, like Diana and me and some other people, to, like, you're not alone. You are not alone. You know, everybody on, Dave Force shared with me his story at SeaWorld. You know, I'm sure Tom Bixby has a story. JD Walsh has a story. Paul Rafferty has a story. Conk definitely has stories.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Another Strong Island guy. And that's what this is all about. It's a community where we come together and we share. And when we share, there's power in the release of that. And Brian Moran, a good friend, of me and the show said over a year ago, and then somebody mentioned this in the chat. Invincibility, vulnerability is the new invincibility. And when you share this, it kind of reduces the power it had over you. And you all help us carry the burden. So it is therapeutic in some way.
Diana, just for Diana real quick. So first of all, thank you for sharing your stories and your experiences in your journey. It's very valuable. Just quick question. You might remember a good friend of mine, Art Middlemas.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, Art we went to the same high school. He was my catcher on the baseball team in high school. We were very close. So yeah, just thought you know Art.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
He was a class above me at the DA's office. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
So
Small
thank you
world.
again. It is very small world.
As Matt Hanlon on the show would say, the world is a block long or 5 blocks long. I forget the exact quote. Brian Moran, thank you for all you do for me, this show. What do you have for us, Brian?
Thanks, Matt. For Diana, I think obviously you were partly the victim of a well-oiled political machine that had a lot of money and some bad intent. And that's the problem. We talk the title of the show is Politics and the Truth, but it could be business and the truth, life and the truth. What we're realizing today is that technology, specifically artificial intelligence and a gullible press and social media, you combine those 3 factors with people with bad intent who have money, and this is what people like you, Diana, are up against. And the question is, how do we combat that as a society? Because that to me, and I get it, that it's generational, that eventually the next generation will figure out how to combat it. But while we're crossing over, the scariest thing for me is that technology right now, and again, a gullible press and social media is going to allow for a lot of bad people to be put into positions of power, whether it's in politics or business. So how do good people step up to defend that? Because otherwise people like you will never run for DA again. And we'll have people like Alvin Bragg.
Yeah, I mean, I think the best way, honestly, is doing conversations like this, because everyone can hide behind an avatar on Twitter and say mean things and fake accounts, but it's really hard to demonize someone when you hear them and you interact with them. I mean, even better if this is in person, but one of the wonderful things about this is, we're all over the world here and we can all come together. At the end of the day, I prided myself. I was neither, the Goldilocks candidate. I was neither, too progressive or too law and order, because, and again, my positions didn't come from, focus groups. It was based on my work and how what brought me to the DA's office in the first place. And when I was running, it was very anti-prosecutor. But I reached out to some of those ultra progressive groups, and I'm still friends with some of the people, even though we don't agree. And I think for me, the thing that really, I think I came away from actually bizarrely having a renewed faith is that when people can strip past the artifice of, this candidate is the archetype of XYZ, the first whatever, and they went to Harvard and they did this, and you just hear what they have to say and you actually listen to what their relevant experience is, then I think people can start to make informed decisions. But you're right. I mean, it's tough because when you have, frankly, lazy journalism, my kitchen cabinet member, my dear friend Barbara, who was Morgenthau's right-hand man, she's a public information person. I mean, she literally lost faith in journalism after my campaign because she could not believe the things that they wrote about me that were just after even interviewing me. And again, I don't want to make this, I'm not a victim. I'm very fortunate. I mean, I haven't even mentioned, I have 2 amazing children, one of which is a junior at UNC. And I have a wonderful husband, and I have the option to figure out my next steps without having to, just get a paycheck. So I don't think of myself as a victim, but I do, I do wonder sometimes what the race would have looked like if there had been just the unvarnished, this is who everybody is. Everyone had the same amount of money. Who would have won? Maybe not me, but I think it would have been a lot more level.
You touched on something that I'm, by the way, Diana is going to be on WBT tomorrow, Charlotte, at 4:20 on the Brett Winterble show with me. And we're going to talk more about politics and what's going on in New York City with Donald Trump. I didn't want this show to, I want this show to be about Diana and rebounding. But, I say on the air, like, I think this is a benefit of having people from different industries, right? And I'm on the air and I'm saying, how come we don't have like salary caps on elections? And you can only spend 500K on a DA election. You can only spend 5 million or 10 million or whatever on a presidential election, and you can't have outside people from other states like George Soros coming in and funding elections in cities throughout the country. Will we ever come to that in our country, Diana, in terms of
Nope.
limits?
No. And the reason is because, I mean, I don't want to sound like, a conspiracy theorist, but the people that are in power are beholden to the people that have the money. So why would they want to upset that? It's not good for all of us. Certainly, if everyone had the same amount of money to spend in politics, yes, you would 100% get better candidates. I mean, as much as I don't regret running, I would doubt that I would run for office again, because I now know what it's wonderful and noble to have a purpose. But at the end of the day, I'm a competitor. I want to win. I'm not somebody that just would run for a purpose. I would run because I want to get the job as much as anything. So no, I mean, I perhaps am a bit cynical, but no, I don't. I hope that day would come, but I really doubt it ever will.
Well, like, just think, what comes to mind is Abraham Lincoln, who was poor, could not be president today. And one of the greatest presidents, in my opinion, we ever had, in today's dollars, today's market, political market, he could not become president. And what a shame. Anyway, what is next for Diana Florence? What's the next mountain for you? Where, as you sit now and you're looking, and I always did this. I always made a list, because as a coach, you're always getting ready to get fired, right? So I always had a list of things I wanted to maybe do. And so what's your list, Diana? What are things that you're putting together saying, I might try that, I might try that. This sounds interesting to me. What is your rebound?
Well, I mean, with the Trump case today, I've been getting a lot more calls. I mean, my expertise is in construction and criminal law and things like that. But, I prosecuted, frankly, Trump as a developer. I prosecuted, a million Trumps in my time. And so I've been asked to do some comment, TV and, on-air commentating. And I've actually really enjoyed that. And I should be clear, like, I do this, I think I texted this to you, Matt, like, I don't do this about whether it's politically right or wrong to prosecute Trump. But to me, I think one of the things that I really enjoy is not talking, forgive my language, but a lot of lawyers talk out their what, right? They're just BSing. And I think it's really important to explain what's happening. I know how it works, what the charges are, and explain them. I have a different theory than what the mass media has predicted the charges are going to be. So to me, I've really enjoyed that. I've thought about writing a book. It's funny, I was talking to a friend of mine the other day, and I was like, I just don't even know where to start. And she sort of said, just start freehanding. And I realize,
I can help you there. I can help you there.
I will definitely be asking you, because it's something I realize that perhaps I do have a unique experience living, the greatest city in the world and interacting with all the people I've done. So I don't know. I'm still thinking about it. It's right now. I've been doing projects here and there, but I'm not. It's more that I know what I don't want to do. And as I said before, my heart is in public service. I don't I would love to find a way back, but I will say to you that unfortunately, I've learned that if I'm not in, I'm not in sort of certain political circles, you don't get the positions that, I would have thought would have been the natural next fit. So I probably have to, at least for now, with the people that are in power now, that's probably public service is not going to happen right now, but we'll see.
Okay. Thank you for that share. And I understand where you are. Fortunately, you can take a step and take a deep breath. You do have a lot to add, like you're adding to us and the shows that you're on. We touched on it. We have 4 minutes to go. For us who are listening, either casually or trying to do a deep dive, tell us what is going on in New York with Donald Trump and his arraignment, for the people that don't, like me, what does all this mean? Why was he charges brought? Give us your 2-minute commentary on that, please.
Sure. So I can't speak to why they were brought. I don't know what the evidence is, and we don't even know what the charges are right now. What's been widely reported is that he's being charged in connection with payments to Stormy Daniels, and that the Trump organization reimbursed him, and they booked it as legal fees, and when in fact it was hush money. Therefore, that's a false statement in the business records, falsifying business records. And what's widely reported is that the underlying crime to make that a felony, because normally just a false entry would just be a misdemeanor, is that it was an illegal campaign contribution, essentially, by Michael Cohen or the Trump organization, however you look at it. I think that's a loser. I don't see that as being the case. If you guys remember, John Edwards, another, unfortunately, one of our Tar Heels, that maybe less, a little more complicated of a Tar Heel. He was prosecuted for the same thing about 12 years ago, and he was acquitted. So to me, that's not the case. I mean, we'll watch for it, and you guys can all check me. We'll see if I'm right. To me, you have 7 payments in 2017 from Trump's personal account to Cohen, and then at some point the Trump organization reimburses Trump. When the Trump organization reimburses Trump and books it as legal fees, what they're doing is they're giving him income. So that's untaxed income for Trump. And if he didn't report that, right, even if he did no taxes on it, you have to report all income. That's a false tax act in New York State. So that would be a tax fraud. That's your underlying crime. So to me, I see this as falsifying business records as a felony with a tax fraud. If in fact he had a tax liability on that $420,000, depending on what it is, in New York, tax fraud tracks larceny. Larceny, if you shoplift a soda, that's a pettit larceny. If you shoplift, a diamond ring, that would be a grand larceny, depending on how big a diamond, right? It could be a $3,000, $5,000, $50,000, whatever. Tax fraud tracks larceny. So if he owed $50,000 in taxes, that would be a much higher felony than the false filings. But regardless of whether they charge tax fraud, that can still be the underlying crime. So that's what I think, they spend all this time litigating to get his tax returns. It would be a surprise to me that they would go with the federal election underlying crime. Doesn't mean it won't happen. Again, I did this work, so I've charged these kind of things. I don't know that the people doing the case have necessarily as much experience in this area. So what's going to happen today real fast is that he's going to surrender like every other white collar defendant. He will give his keys and his wallet and his cell phone to his lawyer. He'll be fingerprinted. There's no more ink. It's just like a photocopy machine. He will be, normally you would be seated in a cell while you're being processed. You give your pedigree information, so you can lie about your weight and height. Nobody's checking you. There's no scale. Once his fingerprints come back, then he will be brought up to the courtroom where he will be. A clerk will say, "Mr. Donald J. Trump, you've been indicted on the following charges. How do you plead, guilty or not guilty?" He'll say not guilty, because if he were to plead guilty, that would be a whole other story, and I don't think that's happening. And then he will be released, because in New York, you can't assume any of these charges, they're nonviolent. are not bail eligible. So that's basically in a nutshell. I think I got it just
There
under.
you go. You did. You nailed it. And I saw Brian Moran and Great Minds Think Alike. I'm thinking Al Capone. You know, what do they get him on? Tax fraud. It is tax season. Taxes are due on the 18th, not the 15th, okay, because of holidays. So, you know, you're getting all kinds of information here on the Rebound Live webcast. Diana, Florence, awesome. Thank you so much for being a friend of the show, and we'll look forward to following your career closely. If those of you want to join, you can get it on online. WBT Charlotte tomorrow at 4:20. The show starts at 4 o'clock. The Brent Witterable show. Look forward to seeing everyone next month, April 2nd at 8 a.m. Rebound Live webcast. Thank you guys. Have a great day.